Hey, friends,
We're back.
we are back.
We have a
Nice.
really special show tonight, Lou.
We do, we do.
I mean, not
Uh,
that any of our shows aren't special, but we have a particularly wonderful guest. I'm
yeah,
excited about. Yeah.
yeah. Not one guest. We have two special guests tonight. This is
Well,
a double billing here.
that's right. We have a guest host tonight.
Nice to see so many familiar names in the attendee panel. Thank you all for joining us. Hopefully, everyone survived the snow okay. Anthony from Port Jeff, good to see you, my friend.
Peter, Susan,
Joe. Lots of
Collier.
friends here. It's really nice to see everyone here on a winter evening with the one and only Dan Blanton and the one and only Henry Cowen.
That's right. That's right. I have a little hint as to what we're talking about tonight right here. This is just an influence fly, but it's not the real deal. And we'll get to see that shortly.
Awesome. Well, we're going to give a couple more seconds here for people to come in, and then we're going to get going because we got a lot to cover.
Yeah, we do.
So why don't we get going, David? How you doing? Are you surviving the snow over there in New Jersey?
Well, we had about 24 inches in my backyard. Nothing like what happened out on the east end of Long Island at 35 to 36 out at where we normally are.
Yep, yep. Well, both of us skedaddled out of there. I heard there was almost 3 feet of snow on our property and about 80-mile-per-hour winds. So I was glad I wasn't there to see that.
In some really huge snowdrifts. I would have loved to have played in them, but So let's get cracking.
Yeah.
This is show number 4 tonight. We only have 2 more left for the season. We should probably flash the schedule so everybody can see what's coming up. As soon as that gets in the middle of everyone's screen.
Yep.
Um,
You got it up there.
yeah, so let's talk about it. So next week, actually, we have 3 shows. We've got Brad Buzzy of the king of the bucktails. After Brad, we've got Nick Valeros from Sandbar Flies, and bringing up the rear, and another Californian is Nick Curcione. So we have an exciting lineup. And on top of that, let me quickly thank the sponsors for this year. And you can put the camera back on me if you want, because I got the actual items in my hands tonight. But we've got a Regent Fortuna by Hardy. Here it is.
Ooh.
This reel's been through a lot, countless albies after last season, and a lot of stripers. Hardy was nice enough to give us one of their Regent Fortuna 8000s. We've got, is that backwards or forwards?
No, you got it. You're right. You're right.
Yeah. So we've got Dave Nelson from Squimfish was kind enough, and his wife Steph, to donate a bunch of their materials. This is some brush that we saw David make a couple of weeks ago. Really incredible stuff. And last but not least, the folks at Royal Wharf were kind enough to donate 3 lines, a floating, a lost tip, and a sinking line. And everyone who signs up for the show or who attends gets an entry. So the more shows you see, the more entries you have. So, spread the word.
Yep.
Unless, of course, you want to make your odds better, then don't tell anybody. But I think, and really quickly, if we want to address this wonderful picture here, we have 3 very handsome-looking guys here: Henry Cowen, Dan Blanton, and in the middle is Lefty. And many of you folks may know that tomorrow is Lefty's birthday. So we're all here to wish Lefty a happy birthday and show this phenomenal photo of 2 of our guests tonight. And of course, we'll keep Lefty in our thoughts. And with that, I want to do a quick introduction. Henry Cowen and I have known each other probably better part of 20 years. And the way we met was like 2 ships passing in the night. I was on my way to Akelands, and Henry was on his way to Crooked, and we just happened to bump into each other at the airport in the Bahamas, in Nassau, and we picked up our friendship then. And Henry last season Henry was one of our natives here, and he's consequently moved to the south. But last season, Henry was on the show, and he did his darting baitfish fly, with a keeled hook and on a jig and also on a jig hook. And it was an incredible session of tying, and it was really incredible to watch. And Henry, we're so proud to have you as our guest host tonight. And we're going to kind of throw the show to you right now, and introduce our guest du jour.
Yeah, and
Well,
David,
thank you.
maybe just really quickly before you take it over, Henry, just on a personal note as well, Henry fished the waters that I should cut my eye teeth fishing as a striper fisherman in the New York Bight, Jamaica Bay. He was doing it before I was doing it, but we share a lot of Brooklyn fishing memories together. Not to mention some other wonderful Brooklyn, hilarious Brooklyn stories that have nothing to do with fishing. And Dan, you don't know this, but you were hugely influential in my own fly tying because your flashtail patterns, which I'm sure you'll talk about tonight, were really the first flies I tied that I fished with great success in the off-color stained waters of Jamaica Bay, which were, I think, in many respects, kind of like the waters that you were fishing in the San Francisco Delta. So you have a very special place also in my mind in terms of my own history of fishing and fly tying. So thank you so much for being here tonight. And Henry, over to you. Thank you for being our guest host tonight. So take it
Yeah,
over.
It's my pleasure. My pleasure. It's funny you mentioned that that was one of your first flies you tied and were successful with was his Whistler. And there was a gentleman who his name was Bruce Olson. Bruce Olson was the vice president in charge of sales and the flies for Umpqua Feather Merchants. And Bruce told me, he's long passed, we miss Bruce. And Bruce used to tell me, if you had a pattern in with Umpqua and it lasted 10 years, because they go through patterns and cycles, and if it could last 10 years, Umpqua considered it a classic. And, I'm just here to say that the Whistler, for sure, is going to be one of those patterns 100 years from now, Luyan, when your grandkids take over this show, they'll be talking about the Umpqua Whistler that Dan created back in the day, and that's still one of their best-selling patterns. So I just want to start off by saying that.
Yeah.
But tonight we have a very special guest, as you said, and Dan and I have been friends for a long, long time. And basically, what I'm going to say is that most people think of him as a fly tyer with the Whistler and the punch flies and the SarMulMacs and all those great, the flashtail clousers, adding flashtails to flies. As a San Francisco, Northern California striped bass guy is where he got a lot of his fame. But what people don't know is way prior to that, he was one of those people that moved the needle in where we are today in fly fishing, where it began. When you think of the beginnings of fly fishing with guys like Lefty, like Joe Brooks, like Lee Wolf, and how they moved it forward, Dan was right in there with those guys, maybe just a little after, because Dan is a little younger. He's only 110, but he's one of those guys that really pushed the needle forward, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So Dan, I really appreciate you coming on tonight and spending the night with these guys, because your stories are just incredibly interesting. And with that, let me ask you this, Dan. When did you start fly fishing? How you about what age were you when you started?
It's kind of a basic story that so many fly fishermen tell. I started fly fishing when I was around 10 years old, and it was for bluegill and small black bass, not big black bass. I wasn't throwing bugs or anything, but I was fishing nymphs, woolly buggers, stuff like that. But my neighbor was 2 houses down. He owned a big plumbing shop, Everett Miller's Plumbing and Heating, and he and his shop foreman played golf, and they were members of the Almaden Country Club and Golf Course. And that golf course had two 2-acre ponds back up in the hills that fed the golf course watering system. And it was full of bass and bluegill. So whenever his buddy would, his would go play golf, they'd drop Bobby and me off at the ponds and pick us up when they were done playing golf. And I just had a fly rod and I had I think it was more of like an intermediate line, not even a real floater, and a short leader. And I tied on, probably 20-pound or 10, mono leader, wasn't even tapered, just straight piece. And I tied on a woolly bugger or some similar fashion. And I'd walk around the shoreline, wouldn't even cast it. I'd dapple it. But if I dappled it by any down tree or tree stump sticking out of the water, even the edge of a tule bank, these big bluegill, that bigger than my hand, would come up. And I'd catch these big bluegill. And they were so much fun. It kept me entertained for hours while they were playing golf. And
well,
then
that's interesting. Because a lot of people don't realize that if you look at state records around the United States, you'll see that California, in their cold water fisheries, even in the lakes and such, have some of the biggest fish ever caught on fly or conventional, for that matter. It's amazing when you talk to people from the West Coast how big the species are that are similar around all parts of the country. California just has a very healthy ecosystem that grows big fish. So, and when did you start saltwater fishing? And when you did, was it San Francisco Bay or?
It was San Francisco Bay. I was probably right around 15, 16 years. When I first was able to get had to be 16. I think that's when it was. I could get my driver's license. I could drive there on my own from San Jose, California, which was 30 miles or so south. And I lived in San Jose, and I could drive up there and park at the Oyster Point Marina. And I had a little car top. No, it was car top at the time, but I ended up getting a little trailer for it. A Starcraft Mariner aluminum boat with a 10 horsepower. I think it was an Evinrude. And I would launch that. There was not an improved launch ramp. It was kind of rocky and bumpy, but I would launch it, hopefully at high tide starting to fall. And I launch it, get in that 10-horse slow-ass boat, and I drive it south 15 miles or so to the San Francisco airport runway pylons and light system. And I used to do that at night when you weren't supposed to. But the bass would get underneath the lights of their approach one-way structure that held their radar system and their lighting system for the airplanes coming in. And the lights would shine in the water, and the striped bass, I could see them blowing up a half mile away. The bait would get underneath those lights, and I'd get so excited, almost pee on myself, driving that slow-ass 10-horsepower boat out there. and then I used PG&E insulators. You've seen these insulators hanging from a pole line that look like mushrooms. Well, I used a string of three that were like three-tiered mushroom anchors, and I would position my boat broadside to that light about a cast away, 75 feet, let's say. And I dropped those mushroom anchors, and they'd go into that soft San Francisco Bay mud, and they would hold like a mud anchor. And I'd tie them up tight so I could cast just outside the light and always fish an outgoing tide, which would sweep my fly line and fly into the pilings. And I would just clear that outermost pilings. I wouldn't hook it and start stripping it slowly out of that light. And rarely did I ever get it far past that light.
And Dan, for a lot of the folks who are regulars here, many of them are East Coast fishermen. Many of them are striped bass fly fishermen. I think a lot of people don't really know about the West Coast striped bass fishery, or they've heard of it. They don't really understand. Maybe for folks here, tell them a little bit about that fishery, because I think it's really unique.
I used to know all the details and written about it, but basically, our Department of Fish and Game wanted to introduce something else to our California Delta, which is over 1,000 miles of navigable, meandering waterways. And they wanted to introduce something else for the base system to help control bait fish populations, things like that. And they knew that the striped bass habitat on the East Coast was very similar to San Francisco Bay's ecosystem habitat. So they introduced a few, not many, striped bass to San Francisco Bay that just automatically during the spring when the runoff would push muddy, dirty water out of the upper river systems into the bay, the stripers would pull up into that Sacramento River Delta channel and migrate through the Delta following the scent, I guess. And they're urged to spawn because they need to spawn in fresh water. And that's how they did it. They just, after they were stocked in San Francisco Bay, they just found their way into the Delta through natural instincts.
Yeah, those aqueducts, right? That would go. They went all the way down to really the northern part of Los Angeles, if I'm not mistaken.
They ended up the fry. They're fry. They couldn't literally swim themselves because there were blocks and locks, but their fry that they spawned in the Delta and around that lower Delta system, just inside the bay, the fry would get pumped into the aqueduct. And those fry would get transported all the way down to Southern California and in other lakes on the way. So, yeah, they got transported from Northern California to Southern California via the California aqueduct system. And
well, I know that to be a fact, Dan, because I know who's on tonight is Al Q from the West Coast, and I know he's got some secret striper spots in that LA area that he won't. I'm not in the club yet, so he won't tell me where, but I know they're there and he catches.
There's only so many. If you look at a map of lakes in Southern California that were connected to this California aqueduct somehow, and I got a map that shows it. You could figure it out. So who introduced you to San Francisco Bay? Do you remember? Was it just a gentleman, or where did you hear about it? I was at 14, 15, 16 years old. I really started reading about saltwater fly fishing and reading Lefty's articles. Lefty didn't even know me then, but he became interested in me when I started fishing San Francisco Bay. Larry Green, he was an outdoor writer for Field and Stream. Very prolific writer, very talented writer, great bullshit artist. And he would write about the bay and in the Delta. And we would go, myself and a couple of buddies, we were teenagers. We'd go to see Larry in San Bruno. And we'd visit with Larry and get information and tips. And he turned me on to the lights under the runways at San Francisco Bay, where you could catch these busting fish at night. Nobody knew about it but him and a couple of his buddies. And then, he introduced me. He talked about stuff like that got me really fired up to try it. And then when I could drive and go up there by myself, then I got a little 14-foot Starcraft Mariner that I had on a trailer.
And that's how it began.
Yeah. I pull it up and launch. And I'd be going out there and an outgoing tide flowing outward at 10 o'clock at night, pitch black. And I'd be driving out sometimes in fog, out from the launch ramp. It was about 2 miles out to the radar screen, the lights. And I'd put out there in the dark, in the fog, get out there, set up anchor, and fish all night until the sunrise. Once the sun started breaking over the horizon, the fish shut off.
Dan, if you were a little younger, like my age or David's age, the three of us would have been palling around doing that stuff back in the day.
There's no question. Yeah. Well, it was just me, and there might have been one or two other guys. I could think of their names if I really thought about it, but that I fished with. They were interested in what I was doing, and so they'd jump in my car in the morning, and there's going to be three. It was my Starcraft would fish three guys if they were careful, one at each end and one in the middle.
So then, how did that morph into the Delta, if I could ask?
Well, again, it was I believe it was Larry Greens was talking about the Delta. He'd been around, and if he hadn't done it himself as an outdoor writer for major magazines, he was in contact with those who did, and they would tell him about it. So he started talking about the Delta and 3 Mile Slough and this and that. So I went up there and got to know a fellow named David Riggs, who owned the Sugar Barge RV park and trailer park, and one of his partners, Chuck Grandin, he had a sports shop, which he added a fly shop to it on the dock, on the water of the Delta on that slough. So he had a floating fly shop, tackle shop on the dock there. And I started getting people interested in going there to fly fish, and they were going to ask him if he had rental boats. He didn't have any. he said, geez, I'm going to get some. So he got a couple. And boy, he couldn't keep them. I mean, they were rented constantly. So,
So then after that, you started, is that how the guiding kind of, figured into your life?
So Chuck would, people would ask him, is there anybody guides? And at the time, Mike Costello, Captain Mike Costello, was the first guy that I knew of. And then there was
Santucci,
Steve Santucci, and one other that's a good friend escaping my mind right now. So there ended up being three of those guys that were doing it, and they would cover different parts of the Delta. It's a vast water system. And then I said, Chuck asked me, Dan, why don't you start guiding? I can keep you busy. I said, well, why not? And then back then, I didn't worry too much about getting a guy's license or a captain's license. We did later when it became necessary. We needed to do that or not get thrown in jail or something. But
Al said he said Kevin Doran.
Kevin Doran.
Yeah.
Yep.
By the way, you have a couple of questions here that came up. Well, first, one point, Jared mentioned 1879 was the first stocking of striped bass from New Jersey.
Interesting.
Which is amazing.
Dan, were you on that bucket crew for putting those striped bass in 18?
Well, I wish I was, but I'd be dead if I was right now.
One question, Anthony asked an interesting question. I think many of the record striped bass have been caught in that West Coast fishery. Would you say Anthony asked, would you say there are more? And Henry, by the way, was regaling David and me with pictures earlier today. Boy, he got into them on Lake Lanier. So, it's interesting. You have three very different striped bass fisheries represented in this Zoom right now. And there are a couple questions about what is the difference between Lake Lanier, the Delta fishing, Montauk, but also there was a question about to Dan about, do you think that the Delta is a more viable striped bass watershed, spawning watershed than the East Coast fisheries? And Dan, your light went off there.
Yeah, I was about to say that.
You have a light in the room now? Yeah, put your light on.
Oh boy.
No, the light in the room.
Yeah, you can turn your overnight light on. Okay. Yeah.
All right.
That's me technical stuff. I'm lost.
Well, for your listening pleasure, while we're waiting, let's take a break. How many people out there, raise your hand if you love Masters of the Fly, raise your hand.
There you go. That's perfect, Dan. Thank you so much.
A lot of hands being raised in the chat. I love it. So Dan, what do you think about the West Coast fishery from a spawning standpoint and as a breeding ground for striped bass? Is it more viable than the East Coast fishery?
I think so because the Sacramento, San Joaquin, and McCollum river systems, which all join, and their labyrinth of rivers and sloughs that connect to San Francisco Bay, and via the Sacramento River, via San Joaquin River, and all these all this labyrinth of waterways that are perfect spawning grounds. They've got current, except for slack tide. They got to go in both ways. So there's always water movement. The stripers need that water movement. They're not going to do well if it's not moving water. If it's still water, you got to have something that will float their eggs for, I think, 72 hours or something like that. But the spawning conditions in that San Francisco Bay, Sacramento, San Joaquin River Delta were perfect for them to spawn. And they spawn by the millions. And those striped bass would get sucked into the egg, the fry would get sucked into the California aqueduct water system that would flow water all the way down to Southern California. It would hit reservoirs in Fresno and Stockton. It would go all over. So we ended up with striped bass and, freshwater impoundments all the way down to San Diego.
But the bait guys really put a hurting on that fishery, didn't they, Dan? For the most part, they took a lot of those big fish that you guys used to catch.
Yeah, they did. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a shame. It's interesting how both coasts have their issues. Here on the East Coast, we have a situation that's ongoing, which the guys from Masters of the Fly had on the American Saltwater Guides Association for the first episode, and they talked about the plight of the striped bass fishery on the East Coast with all the commercial hauling that's going on and the poaching and this and that. And you guys on the West Coast have your own set of problems with the people that want to get rid of striped bass because of salmon and water quality. And so
basically,
stripers they really get hit from both sides of the country.
But they stripe in that short period of time when stripers really took a hold after they initially stocked the first ones. Once they took a hold, they developed such a popularity with a segment of anglers that when they wanted to eradicate them, they wouldn't let it happen. So we had to live with it. So they figured out, okay, what do we do? What do we need to do? So they could try to protect the salmon and steelhead fisheries because the stripers would eat the crap out of those. And they were able to do it. So we ended up with being able to have all of them. We had our salmon, we had our steelhead and striped bass and black bass, largemouth bass. In fact, I don't know, largemouth bass, they probably preyed on salmon and steelhead fry just as much as anything else.
I'm sure.
Yeah,
I'm sure.
So and we'd have those. It just was, and so it sort of reached a balance where things kind of held their own.
Are they still fighting that fight out there, Dan?
Not that I'm aware of, but then again, I haven't been on top of it in many years. But
let me ask you
still fishing for them. We still have them, and it's still got party boats that go out in San Francisco and San Pablo Bay just for the striper runs. In spring and fall. We got them that fish up in the Delta on the river system. We've got guides, independent guides like Mike Costello that take people out all over, way up into the upper system in the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta. So it's a viable fishery still, along with the others. So they're not going anywhere. And
I understand.
I think they sort of reached I don't know what you're going to call it, a voluntary or just a natural balance.
I wish you would have called me years ago when you were fighting that water fight with those guys wanting to eradicate, because I had the right guy to help you do that. Al Q he would have put a hit on those people out there, and that would have eradicated the whole thing. I had a guy from New York for you.
Al Q and I became good friends, and I haven't talked to him in a while, but he came up here and fished with me. He was very aware of our fishery and our situation.
Oh, yeah.
He wrote about it.
Al is on tonight, and he's chatting in the chat here. And Al's been a really loyal audience member of Masters of the Fly. Thanks for being here, Al. But there's a question. I don't know if you know the answer to this. I'd never even heard about this, but David asked about how's the fight going to protect the Delta from the water buffaloes who keep stealing the water. Is that a thing? I don't know much about that. Dan, do you know anything about?
I think they've kind of worked out.
Okay.
I can't give you statistics or positive, but I think Department of Water Resources in Southern California and their aqueduct system and Department of Fish and Game, they've all kind of worked out a program so that we can have our striped bass. They have enough water for them to spawn in the upper river system, and they got water enough to ship down south to the Central Valley for agribusiness and all the way down into Southern California to fill up some of their big reservoirs for civic water uses. And anyway,
Julian, I can tell
you, it sort of worked out.
I can tell you for a fact that the way like Ted's Montana Grill sells bison, all the California around the Delta and whatnot, all the restaurants are serving water buffalo. Meatloaf. That's what they're doing now.
It tastes like hamburger.
That's it. Yeah. So Dan, let me ask you this. So you started guiding in the Delta. How did that lead? Where did the Whistler come into play? I know everybody, that's such a wonderful fly you designed way back when. And I know it wasn't specifically but striped for stripers, but tell us a little history about the Whistler.
No, let me tell you, the Whistler was, as far as I'm concerned, specifically designed for San Francisco Bay stripers. At the time before I really got into heavy duty fishing in San Francisco Bay flats for stripers and all those places from South San Francisco all the way down to San Mateo on the flats down there. I was a salmon steelhead fisherman up on the North Coast, the Smith River, the Checo River, those coastal streams. And one of the top flies was were comet style flies, the gold comet, the silver comet, and they were basically had a bucktail tail, and they had a red chenille collar, and then they had a big full 2 or 3 hackle wound frontal hackle to push water. And I was tying those for salmon, and I tied the first one for striped bass. And at the time there was a bucktail lead head jig that was really popular with the gear guys, and it was all white with a white lead head, but it had a red stripe down the center on each side. So I just tied my version or answer to that bucktail. And so I tied a whistler with a white bucktail wing that was stacked in three bunches, so that, you had a vertical broad wing. And I put a thin stripe of, 6-8 strands of red bucktail down the side to give it a red stripe. And then I tied a couple of turns of red chenille in front of the bucktail wing. And then I tied in a wide web hackle face, usually about three white webby saddle hackles wound in to give it a full broad hackle face. And I was an old salmon guy, and all of our salmon flies, most of them had bead chain eyes. So we were all tying our striper flies. It just seemed natural to put bead chains on them for weight, and they get them to dip and dive. And I wanted my whistler to dip and dive like a jig. So I weighted it frontal weight with lead wire behind the eyes and in front of the chenille collar. Then I put pretty good size chain bead eyes on it, and then a full hackle. So when I fished it in that turbid water, you might have had 1.5 to 2 feet of visibility on a good day in San Francisco Bay, but it pushed a lot of water. And I knew stripers could find anything.
Yeah, they needed to feel it, didn't they?
And Dan, I think I know you have one of those sitting on your desk in front of you, but around what year did you develop that fly?
I want to say it was 1974, but it was the early 70s.
Oh,
I can't remember the exact year. Early 70s.
Did you take that down to for tarpon? Did you fish that fly for tarpon?
My whistler was the first fly that I took down to Costa Rica to Casamar. And I caught the first tarpon on a fly at Casamar back in the early 70s. It was before Bill Barnes was involved in it. It was Carlos Barantes, one of the owners that was a businessman in San Jose, Costa Rica, had some partners in Florida who didn't give a crap about fly fishing, but they'd go down there and fish bucktail jigs, basically mooching a bucktail jig in the current to jump those tarpon. Well, I went down there and I started tying the white whistler. I used to call it the white whistler red, but it was an all white whistler with a red chenille, 2-turn red collar behind 3 turns of big white hackle and a red bucktail stripe. I called it. I wasn't tying at that time with a flashtail because we didn't have fly shaboo that was very movable back then. We didn't do that until later when we started getting fly shaboo. But I started tying a whistler for that river. And
Dan, David, you have one in front of you, right?
And David, you said you used to fish tarpon with that whistler. You had a lot of success with it, didn't you?
Oh, I love, like, here, this sort of, it's really influenced by whistler. It's not a whistler, but like this has been a great fly for me in Campeche, fishing in water over 5 feet deep.
Well, I've tied it. Whistler comes in so many colors, but I don't know if you can see this one.
Mm-hmm.
This is black and orange with a grizzly. Black and orange was a great color down there in that turbid water.
Yeah.
It's great color in San Francisco Bay. It was kind of turbid. Another one I liked a lot, especially at night, was the all black or this chocolate brown. Mm-hmm. And you see, I noticed I had this is cactus sparkle chenille. The original just had a couple of turns of regular chenille, but it had a high vertical wing. This happened to be multi-layered of white, brown, and grizzly, and that collar's full. There's three hackles wound in there to make that collar. The bead eyes used to be big chain bead. So this style of fly I brought this to Costa Rica and to Panama, Campeche.
In in waters that are not crystal clear, those colors are beautiful. Those dark colors are
these
fantastic.
These work down there in those turbid waters, worked in San Francisco Bay. I mean, they worked in San Luis Reservoir. They just, and another great color was as chartreuse, flashtail with black.
Hold that up a little higher, Dan. Hold that up. There you go.
Look at that.
Chartreuse with a red chenille, sparkle chenille collar, black overwing, chartreuse underwing, a short 2-inch extended flashtail mixture of pearl flash and silver flash, and then a pretty full collar, 2 to 3 hackles, a couple of blacks, a couple of chartreuses. But that kind of fly, big bead chain eyes and things like that, that style I brought to Costa Rica back in the 70s. And I, of course, have been using it in San Francisco Bay since the mid 60s.
Well,
my first Whistler was all white with a red stripe. I called it the White Whistler Red.
And Dan,
there's an unfair question here, and I have to read it to you because all of us who fly fish really, and it's from Ben, and he says, of the flies you've invented, if you can only fish one for all time, which would it be?
It would be a Whistler's Whistler variation.
I think that's a good choice.
No, because I know that fly works everywhere in fresh and salt, from largemouth bass to redfish to striped bass to tarpon. It works for all these species because it represents a huge variety by just changing the size.
And Dan, am I correct that the name Whistler comes from the sound that it actually makes from the bead chain?
My original Whistler, and it still is. You see on this fly, if you can see it up here.
Hold it up real high there, Dan.
Hold it up towards your mouth.
Into your left. Yeah.
But you see the chain bead eyes, the holes in the chain bead eyes, when I first tied chain bead eyes on, because that's what I didn't have lead eyes back then. So chain bead eyes, and we wrap some lead wire around the shank behind the eyes. But the orifices in those chain bead eyes, when I'd be casting it back when I could hear, it'd be going by my head, say 5, 6, 7 feet out or up. I could hear it whistling.
Yeah, I can tell you as a guide, when I'm using whistlers, I always know when one's coming from my head and I know when to duck off the platform.
Yeah. Well, I could hear it. That's why I call it a whistler.
And that fly has been in Umpqua's catalog now for as long as I can remember. Do you remember when Umpqua came a calling sometime in the 80s, probably?
Yeah, it was in the 80s.
Late 80s, early 90s.
I don't know if it was Bruce or Dave or some of the guys. They followed my website, followed me in my articles and what I was writing about it, and talking about the Whistler, San Francisco Bay and other places, Sacramento Delta. And they said, hey, this needs to be in your catalog. Dan Blanton.
And here it is 40 years later, and it still is.
Amazing.
Yeah. So,
isn't that incredible? Going back to what we talked about earlier with Bruce Olson saying it's a classic if it lasts 10 years.
Yeah.
And here's one that went 40 and it's still going,
Yeah.
I mean, that's the case in point right there.
I only attribute to it because it's a style of fly, whether it's a gold comet or silver comet, salmon steelhead fly, or it's a Whistler style. It's a style of fly that's kind of universal, works everywhere. And you just have to vary the size and color.
Well, I know Lefty loved the fly. Lefty used to talk to me about it all the time. Matter of fact, tell us about, didn't you fish with Lefty a couple of weeks out in your area on the Delta?
Yes, he came out. Lefty got to know me through my website. I think people referred him to it. Hey, this guy in California, he's doing this, doing that. And so Lefty contacted me, called me, and he started looking at my website on the internet.
The bulletin board.
Bulletin board. Yeah, it's still up. My bulletin board's still running after all these years.
And for those that want to know, it's danblanton.com.
Right. Tom just put the link in the chat.
Yeah.
So everyone.
danblanton.com, and it leads you to a banner with all the different contents of my website. And there's a link for a bulletin board. And you go there, takes you to a bulletin board where you can go and ask a question, or you can read a question, but you can ask a question. Somebody can answer it for you. but it's not as used as much as it used to be because of social media, other social media platforms, but it's still being used, and it's the oldest of its platforms type.
And, people should know out there, Dan, when we talked earlier about you moving the needle, today everybody's on, Instagram and Facebook and, what have you out there. Back in the 90s, we didn't have an internet really to talk about. No. So everything was basically, we had an internet. We didn't have the social media platforms. So everything was either real time or you wanted information. It was real time, Dan Blanton, bulletin board, or Stripers Online. Those are the three that I remember. And that's where we got our information, along with all the magazines that were out at the time.
And it's where we share.
Like Fly Fisherman or Saltwater Fly Fishing or Fly Fishing in Salt Waters. We all scurried for those.
Yeah, for that you're information. So right. They were the only platforms available for people to go to and read about and learn stuff, but they could also contribute. I made it so people could go on my board and post a fly and talk about it and get a big thread going on this or that. So it was a great place to share information as well as learn.
And Dan, yours was really the first or one of the first. And what year did you begin that?
I'm trying to remember. It was mid to late 70s.
No,
I don't remember the exact year. I don't remember the exact year.
The bulletin board, I believe you started sometime in the early 80s when it came out in 83, 84. I remember finding out about that. And I remember that all kind of developed from all the writing you had done with Sport Fishing Magazine and all those other magazines that you wrote for.
I don't remember the exact. That sounds about right. Yeah, it sounds about right. That's a long time ago. I'm starting to forget shit like that.
Yeah, it was back then. It was probably not to your point, Henry. It wasn't even internet. It was dial-up, probably. Right?
Yeah,
true bulletin board.
So Dan, let me ask you this. I don't mean to jump back and forth, but what I found really interesting are stories that you and I have talked about over the years. What I found really interesting was that you were kind of in the early development for fast sinking lines. You were right there in the beginning of it, before we called them 357s and density compensated. It was all these LC lead core lines. Tell us a little bit about that.
I was with a group of salmon fishermen like Bill Shad and some of those North Coast king salmon fishermen and steelhead fishermen, mostly king salmon. And in those rivers that would go into spate sometimes, we used Gladding Mark V or whatever it was, lead core trolling line, and we'd cut lengths from 20 feet long to 30 feet long, 25 feet long, put a loop on each end, and we'd loop it to our monofilament shooting line, which could be any good monofilament shooting line from Maxima to whatever, and we'd loop it to the shooting line, maybe usually 25 to 30 pound test, and that would be our sinking line. And I started mixing them up. I'd take 25 feet of 25 or 30 pound test, and I'd put a lighter section, say a 15 pound test, because you could get it in 3 or 4 different pound tests. And all that meant was you had a smaller or larger lead core covered over by a braided nylon core. And we carried line wallets that had all these different sizes and lengths of lead core shooting heads. So we could fish any river, pool, any hole, at any time, high water, low water, and salt water. So we could cover the water with those lead core heads. And today I still use them. I got my lead core heads in my line wallets. I don't know how many other people do, but I go to San Luis Reservoir. I might have a SA3, type 3 combo, type 2 mixed density line, but I'll still have lead core lines in my line wallet.
I still have a spool. Lefty sent me a spool of lead core that he made up for me striper fishing on Lanier, and I still have it here, and I'm scared to use it because it came from Lefty,
Yeah. Well, Lefty came out, he read my stuff. I don't know if somebody turned him on to my board, but he read the stuff that was going on then. And again, my board was pretty much the only fly fishing platform at the time. It was before Fly Fisherman magazine or any of those things. And he started going there. And then I started posting, answering questions. He became part of my community. And then that's how he got to know me, and we became really close friends. And he wanted to come out and experience some of the Delta and experience San Francisco Bay, South San Francisco Bay, so he could write about it, know about it. So he came out, spent a couple of weeks with me out here, and we fished the South Bay together. We fished up in the Delta, ran around all the sloughs up there using lead core lines of different lengths. And then eventually the manufacturers started making vinyl coated sinking lines of multiple densities. So you could order a multiple density sinking line that was a regular fly line. And all that came out from a lead core shooting line.
I imagine Jim Teeney was one of the first, I imagine, for that.
Yeah, Jim Teeney was there using his probably a combination of lead core and something for the river fishing up there for salmon. Jim Teeney was a salmon fisherman and salmon steelhead fisherman. But every year I go up, spend 30 days on the Smiths River fishing for king salmon and tidewater, and maybe up the first 2 or 3 pools upriver. Jim was always there and on the Chetco in Oregon. So we fished all those together, and those are the lines we used. There wasn't anything else. But
Dan, Al Q is asking for you to talk about Myron Gregory also.
Yeah, Myron Gregory. Thank you. I got to give credit where credit due. Myron Gregory was probably the first that was using lead core shooting heads. And if I recall, now that you mentioned, Myron was one of the ones that kind of turned me on to it because he was a kind of a hero. He belonged to San Francisco Golden Gate Casting School, and he fished the South Bay and around San Mateo. And Myron, we'd go visit Myron. I was late teens. Myron would tell all these stories, and he'd show me about the lines he was using. He had a coil of different size lengths of lead core line. And again, they were made mostly out of Gladdy Mark V lead core trolling line. So Myron was one of the first, and he was very influential for me and a couple others that continue to go on and do different things.
Dan, I want to just say, I want all our young listeners out there, people under 40 that listen to this program. You made a very good point just then. You said, and I quote, "I want to give credit where credit is due." There's nothing wrong with everybody coming up with their own stuff, but if you're inspired by something, I love the fact that you say, "Oh, and I got this from blah, 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 blah." And I think that's very honorable, and I think that's really important for people to hear.
I think it's for all the things you just said, and I'm flattered, but it's also it's basically the right thing to do. You can't skip developmental history. If you do, you're leaving out a whole phase of what happened. You've got cutting a big chunk out of history. You got to start as early as you know when this started and who started by who. I happened to be there when it was going on, starting to go on. And I wasn't the first, but I came in pretty soon after.
Well, but you were popularizing it because of your platform from the board and from writing. And that leads me to another question. I don't know that a lot of people know out there, but you really are the guy that popularized fishing with 60-degree bend jig hooks. And I know you'll be the first to tell everybody that it came from an angler that you met through Texas. As a matter of fact, you and I and George Glazner, who is the gentleman who invented the spinster fly, and that's how you and I became buddies, was through George, because George and I had my coyote with the spinner blade, his spinster with a spinner blade, 2 different looks completely, never knew each other, and both of us came to your board and we met him. But I really want you to talk more about, you really took something, a lot of what comes from the East Coast migrates to the West Coast for the fly anglers. Here's one of the huge things that came from you on the West Coast that migrated to the East Coast. Tell us a little bit about jig hooks, because you really popularized them.
Well, I can't tell you the exact evolution, but I like to fish with bucktail leadhead jigs as well as flies. So I had spinning rod and a casting rod with a standard leadhead bucktail jig. And of course, those bucktail jigs all had a 60-degree bend and the hook rode point up. And I thought, well, why not make a tie one of my flies on a jig hook and design it so it rides hook point up, so it's not constantly catching on oyster bars in San Francisco Bay in 2-3 feet of water. So I started tying them on a 60-degree bend jig hook, and I would put big lead chain bead eyes on it because I come from my salmon fishing days, chain bead eyes for look and for movement and sound. Tied some 3 or 4 turns of leaded wire behind them, and then the big hackle. That's it. Basically, the Whistler and that style of fly evolved from salmon flies, king salmon flies, comets, and things like that.
Right. But George's spinster fly with the 60-degree bend must have made some impression on you when you were down fishing with him in Texoma. By the way, for anybody who doesn't know,
I got sidetracked.
Texoma, Lake Texoma is the single best striped bass fishery in freshwater with the best reproduction of stripers in the country. Nobody produces more fish naturally than Lake Texoma, and you got to fish it, Dan, and you got to fish it with George. So, how was that fishery?
I was talking about it on my forum, fishing with a jig hook and my flies, and I'm sure I got the idea maybe from George's flies. I don't know, but I didn't know George at the time. But I was writing about, and George, somehow, I don't remember the details, but he found my forum and he started following my forum. And then when he started reading about the jig hook and I was talking about it, then he started communicating with me and I got more background on how he came up with it. And so I learned the history, and I was never one to take credit where it wasn't due. So when I found out George was probably the first that I'm aware of, tire to use a 60-degree bend jig hook to tie a fly on, I made sure he got credit for that.
And have you ever gut hooked a fish on a 60-degree bend jig hook? Because I never have.
No. I can't recall ever gill hooking or gut hooking one. It's always the top of the mouth, always the top of the mouth or the corner of the mouth.
Yeah,
that was the other great thing about it. You could hook small fish, and you wouldn't harm them. You just lip hook them or hook them top of the mouth kind of thing.
And by the way, for anyone interested in tying with 60-degree bend hook jig hooks, there's a great demonstration of it on Masters of the Fly via Henry Cowen from last season. So we'll put the link in the chat if you want to see how Henry ties.
And Steve Ferraro owes him a bit of thanks too, because that flounder fly came from the jig hook, which I showed Steve, which Dan really from George and Dan showed me, so it's just amazing how it just passes around.
Yeah. Well, it was, and I take credit for this and I'm proud of it. My forum was the first one of its type, and people from all over the country and world started following my forum. And I used to get, the questions and the sequences used to be, yard long. It's not so much anymore because they're using other platforms. But at the time, it was where you went if you wanted to ask a question about anything like that. And people came, and George was there. He was answering, and he was very flattered. He got a lot of miles out of my board for the Glazner and his style, the spin blade fly, spinster, I guess is what he called it.
Yeah, the spinster. So tell us. I have another question for you. Just tell us the story, because we got two greats on the West Coast that we never talk enough about besides yourself. You and Nick Curcione. Tell us how you met Nick.
Okay, now I never knew Nick or knew of him, but I would take my fly fishing club, the Flycasters of San Jose. I would hire a Greyhound bus and take 15 or 20 of my club members by the Greyhound bus from San Jose down to King Harbor. And I would I threw my pram in the back of the bus, but my club members would they used to have those big wooden rental boats. You could put 2 people in them. And
this was in the bay, right?
Right inside the breakwater. We wouldn't go outside.
What were you fishing for?
We were fishing for bonita.
Okay.
Bonita. And most of my members had never caught anything that showed them their backing since they put it on. But bonita, even those 2 or 3 pounders, would burn 100 yards into your backing if you didn't have a tight enough drag. Hey, those things went. So I took them down there to experience that kind of thing. And they'd rent those wooden rental boats. They'd anchor up around that inside hot water blowhole boil that attracted anchovies and bait fish to that hot water boil and whatever they were pumping out through Roundup bait or whatever. And they'd sit there and cast into that and hook bonita after bonita after bonita, and then into their backing, and they were whooping, hollering. They loved it. So,
So what happened when you got off the bus?
Oh,
and you were getting your pram.
I forgot. You got me. I'm easily sidetracked. Well, one of the times I unloaded the bus, and it was third or fourth trip down. I got out, and my club members were starting to walk down towards the harbor master, the boat rental place, and I was coming up last because I had my pram in the back, and I had a little loader. And as I was starting to roll it myself, this guy comes walking up. He says, "Hey, do any of you guys know Dan Blanton?" I said, "Yeah, I know Dan Blanton." He says, and he said, "Well, I'm Nick Curcione, and I've been reading Dan's stuff and his board and da da da. I'd like to meet him." I said, "Well, good to meet you. Good to meet you." It was, I said, you got me. And he goes, "Oh, wow, man." And then so we'd become close friends from that day on. And that was way, way, way long time ago. But he came up to the boat. He came up to the bus looking for me. Because he was he knew we were coming down. He read it on the board that I was coming down with my club fish out. So he was waiting there for me, and I'm so glad he was, because we've been very close friends ever since.
That's a great story.
Great. Yeah. I just want to remind everybody that Nick will be our last guest this year, Masters of the Fly, and I spoke to him briefly before the show, and he said hello. I don't want to take something for granted that we brought up. When we've had ASGA on the show, we've talked about hooks and the kind of hooks that injure fish and don't. And you brought up a very good point, Dan, about the jig hooks and how they hook up fish. And I just want our guests to take note of that, because, we're working very hard to protect striped bass here. And I know you guys are on the West Coast, and the hook type that we all use is vitally important for the survival of the fish, or for mortality. And what you're saying about the jig hook, I think Lou jibes with the statistics that we had come out that we talked about earlier this year. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, there's been some really good research that's come out of Massachusetts Department of Marine Fisheries that the app that I developed with Tom Fuda here, GotOne, was involved with collecting the data from anglers, and was very clear the link between fish, striped bass in particular, that were gut hooked or foul hooked, and mortality level. A fish that is hooked in the mouth properly and not held out of the water too long and released quickly has a very, very high likelihood of survival, but those odds go way down when those hooks go deeper than the mouth. So any hook configuration, and in fact, so we did a lot of work, and David's referring to this, to work with tackle manufacturers to take trebles off of lures, plugs, and replace them with single hooks.
Singles.
And so it's nice to hear that even when we're using single hooks in a much lower damage kind of scenario with flies, that the jig hook actually is even safer for the fish than a traditional J hook.
Yeah.
It's true.
Back when I was tying my whistles on a standard J hook, I always tied them on a fairly short shank, nothing longer than 1x long, but I tied them on a fairly short live bait standard hook. But you still couldn't help, but they engulf flies. Mm-hmm. So with a standard J hook, you'd hook so many in the gills because they'd suck it in, and you'd get them. And I said, yeah, gotta be. But then I threw bucktail jigs too. And I go, why don't I tie my flies on a bucktail, on a jig hook, a jig hook, and put the bead eyes on and weight it tie it so that hook point up.
And it's really interesting you say that, Dan, because the bucktails are mostly tied on 90-degree bend jig hooks.
Right.
Where our flies we tie on 60. So a 90 degree is like this, and a 60 degree is like that. And I got to tell you, I was a spin fisherman long before I was a fly fisherman. And I remember catching thousands of bass on a bucktail. I don't ever think I remember gut hooking a fish with a bucktail. So I just think that really proves a point.
Yeah. Well, that exactly. I went through that same kind of thinking too, but I realized on San Francisco Bay in the shallow water that a 60-degree bend hook tied properly would skim over those shallow oyster bed bottoms without hooking up constantly. If that hook rode down, you wouldn't get a retrieve to the bank.
Mhm.
You know, it's just that shallow. We were waiting at the time. It was a little bit different once I got a boat. I could get out in a little deeper water. But even then, using the 60-degree bend jig hook, it just fished so much better. And you hook the fish in the corner or top of the mouth. It rarely ever hooked one in the gills. It just made sense. It was just more. It's just the way to go. So that's what I started tying and promoting it.
Well, we just had an engineer type in, I think Lulian Mark Keller said, and he's an engineer, so he would know. I think he said something about the 60-degree bend jig hooks.
Similar
the same
geometry
as a circle hook.
Yeah.
Which you don't get them hooked in the and if anyone would know, Mark would know because he's a Lanier guy, so
Yeah.
he's got to know.
Yeah. I fished Lanier and I fished San Luis Reservoir.
How did Lanier compare to some of your freshwater fisheries out there?
I think at the right time, right places on San Luis Reservoir, the O'Neill forebay, you couldn't top it in terms of numbers and also you big fish. I mean, I caught my personal best out of San Luis, a 40-pounder on a fly, and I caught a lot of fish in the 25. But those two reservoirs, if the wind came up, you were like in the North Sea. So Lanier, to me, was a more natural lake. It had cover. It didn't get 4 foot, 5 foot waves on it. At least I wasn't there when I did that.
So you're saying it's an old man fishery?
Yeah, well, it's a smart man's fishery. Because I would take people out fishing. I would guide people on San Luis Reservoir in the O'Neill forebay, but I had a stipulation. I said, if the wind's blowing over 10 miles an hour, we're not going. Because that's how rough it could get.
David, what I found interesting on his previous story about fishing when he met Nick Curcione, he was bonita fishing, and he said, and there was anchovies. Isn't it funny how bonita, no matter where they are, find anchovies?
It's universal, Pacific or Atlantic. It's always about the anchovy, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's true.
Dan, a quick question, and this was from Anthony. Just going back to hooks, did you find the jig style hook gave a different action to the fly over a straight hook?
The way I tied my flies, the wing was tied in vertical layers. You had the underwing that was tied on the bottom side of the upturned hook behind the eyes, behind bead eyes. You might have two bunches of that on the bottom side of the hook. Then you went over the top of the hook with the color variations. But by tying them that way, you almost was certain to have that hook point up. But if you try to do anything else, it would list to one side. But you wanted to keep that fly trimmed and balanced with your materials so that hook would always ride hook point up.
Can you hold that fly up that you have in your hand right there?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
See, this got a little flashtail in it, not much. Then this happened to have 2 underwings to give it girth, and then it's got the overwing, and it's got flash down the side, and it's got the chain bead eyes, or not chain bead, they're hourglass eyes, and it's got the flashtail and all that. So this style of fly, we had threadfin shad and American shad in that reservoir, which are deep-bodied bait fish compared to other kinds of minnows. So we wanted a fly that had fairly good girth to it, and then a little fly tail that would wiggle out the back. And this style of fly today, even after all these years, is still very productive. And I even tried whistlers. Whistlers. Here's a kind of mashed up whistler that with the big front hackle collars. But I also tied it similarly with the wing, stacked in layers to give me that kind of wing with a Worcester collar.
You know, Dan, I'm going to just say I find this interesting. If you ask most anglers today, the trend seems to be going back to more natural materials lately.
Mm-hmm.
Prior to that, the previous 5 to 10 years, we saw a lot of hybrid tying where they took naturals with synthetics and blended. And that's exactly what you've been doing for 40 years with your Whistler. You know, before, again, we talk about moving the needle and where it started. And here, 40 years later, that becomes kind of a hot thing is tying. I mean, you take Johnny King as a tyer. A lot of what he does is blending synthetics with naturals. And,
it was kind of a natural.
I just think it's incredible when you think about it.
Yeah, it was a natural thing to do. We didn't have that many kinds of materials and quality materials. So you would take what you had and blending natural fibers with synthetic fibers to get a longer wing or extension or different colors. It just became the thing to do. And it made it easier so we could tie these different things. It's like this fly here, I don't know if you can see it, but that's just a version of my SarMulMac with a big head and with the eyes glued on, and it's got a flashtail and it's got that same type of wing. So you could
another really good fly.
Yeah.
Dan, let me ask you this real quick. I know you've been to Australia a couple times and you got to fish with Rod Harrison, who won't invite me to Australia, which makes me think he's a brilliant guy because he won't invite me. But tell us a little bit about Australia and your favorite fish.
Well, again, through my website bulletin board, I met people from all over the world that contacted me. And I was able to connect with Rod Harrison through my board. And then I found out about his stuff, his website, and his doing his writings. And then he was writing for, I believe, Saltwater Sportsman or Fly Fishing in Saltwaters magazine. And we became collaborators. And when I went to Australia for the first time, of course, I connected with Rod and others too. But Rod was there when I got there, and he took me fishing in the backcountry, mangroves and things like that. So I was able to experience in a 2-week trip as much as I could possibly could that he could show me. And then, of course,
what was your favorite? What was the favorite species?
The favorite species then for me was the barramundi, because it was kind of like a stripers, and we were fishing backcountry, lagoon style mangrove waters, and some of it was fairly shallow, some of it was a little deeper, but it was just the kind of water you fish with a Whistler. You wanted something that pushed water, flashtail.
Did you get to fish queenfish? Did you get to fish with for queenfish?
Oh yes. Queenies were just there. If we went out of the backcountry into the ocean, queenies were everywhere. I mean, you could go out.
That's a cool fish.
Yeah, it really was one of my favorite. They jumped. They ate really good. They weren't fussy. They ate good, and boy, did they jump. And you could go out as long as you got anywhere offshore a little bit. You didn't have to be out there miles. Just get out past the surf line a little bit, maybe a mile or two, and just start drifting. And if you found anything floating, it would be surrounded by queenfish. And you can throw almost any fly in the water, you get bit.
Did you I used to read about, and I never asked you this, I used to read about these guys taking these offshore boats out of California to go on these tuna, what did they call those trips?
The long range.
Did you get to do that?
Oh, yes, I got to do it. In fact, I even chartered the boat sometimes and took my own people down. Yeah, it was great. If you went with the long range boats, they would load their live wells up with live anchovies. So when you got down there, we had volumes of live chum. They could dip the dip net in there, get a scoop of live anchovies, shake it over the side, and the dolphin fish and all the dorado, all those fish would just swarm in on those live anchovies. It just erupt around the boat, and they didn't have to. All you had to do is hit the water with a fly, and you were on.
How far out were you when you were doing that on one of those trips?
Sometimes we're only 8-10 miles off off the beach. Other times we would go farther south. If the water was cooler north, we'd go farther south. But it was never that long a run. And then, of course, we also stayed overnight on the boat. The boat had sleeping quarters.
They were a couple of days, right?
Yeah, it was at least a couple of days, sometimes longer. And we would have the live bait for chum. Now, I would tell you that you could still catch them without chum, but not nearly as well.
Yeah.
That live bait, the live chum, is what turned it on and kept
I've heard that our host David does that on the flats out in Gardner's. He throws live chum to get the fish around the boat.
I wouldn't doubt it. I think I've heard of guys chumming out there on the East Coast.
There actually are some guys they do it quite a bit in Florida. Actually, they'll take pinfish and throw them in the water to bring algae.
They chum with live pinfish.
But let me ask you this, because some people would like to know. Inquiring minds want to know. With all the places you've been, have you kept count as to how many species you've caught on a fly?
I know I can't give you exact count. Probably at one time I could have, but I know it's been over 30 different species.
Wow.
Maybe over 40, fresh and salt water.
Yeah.
Because my whistler, like a lefty deceiver, could be used to simulate such a variety of different bait fish. And they worked in fresh and salt water both. And I wouldn't and I would say also a Clouser style fly.
Yeah.
So a deceiver style fly, a whistler style fly, and a Clouser style fly. If you had those three styles, you had it covered.
And to that end, is there a species of fish you haven't fished for that you wish you kind of had?
I really can't think of one. I've caught a lot of species of fish on
David,
fly.
I can tell you a more recent species of fish that he's fallen in love with in the last 10 years.
Love to hear it.
Carp.
Oh yeah, but that's been longer than 10 years. I got interested in carp fishing, I believe, from George Glazner, maybe you, but it was something that I wanted to do because it was at the time fly fishing for carp came on as a kind of a new venue, a new thing, and I had carp all around me in different public lakes. I went up and spent 3 weeks, or maybe longer, up on the Columbia River, up in Oregon, because that river was full of big carp, and they had a lot of extensive flats along the shorelines and little coves and stuff. I went up there for 2 or 3 weeks just to fish for carp. And I have
on the bank, waiting.
Yeah, I was waiting for carp, and I have pictures of me standing up to my waist in the water. My boots sunk down the mucky mud about 6 inches, and I had to really be careful. I had to be careful to break my heel free of the mud before I took a step. Otherwise, I'd go flat on my face, fill up my waders. But I get out there, and I would just move a little bit here, a little bit there, and just cover this big expanse of flats. And this carp would just be coming. They'd coming from the left, they'd be coming from the right, and you could see them rolling. And all I had to do was drop a fly somewhere in front of them. You could either sink slowly, or I could start retrieving it, and they ate it. It was
great.
Didn't
need a passport.
No, didn't need a passport. I didn't have a blood test. Nothing. It was great. No, I really loved it. I wrote about it, and it was one of the most enjoyable fishing excursions I'd been on.
Dan, if we would have told this story 15 years ago, your 50 years, 60 years of building up your reputation would have just been shot if we told that story 15, 20 years ago.
I haven't caught a carp on fly, and I'm
I don't know.
Lou, I'll tell you where you can catch a carp on fly. Right down the street,
Central
Park. I live
Park.
in New Jersey. We've got the Meadowlands, and the Meadowlands are loaded with carp. And every April, I run down there for a day or two with a fly rod and fish from shore. Because, if you walk in the water there, you sink up to your knees in mud.
I have a friend that does it in Central Park.
Oh my gosh, the Robo Pond, it's just full of huge carp. Yes.
Well, it seems like most impoundments, lakes, whatever, that have rivers with big flats, that have a lot of carp, have real mucky, muddy bottoms, because that's how they get down there and they blow around in that mud, sucking up nymphs and clams, especially if there's freshwater clams and by the millions in those rivers. They get down there and they get around, suck them up. Yeah, it's a great fishery, and I know there's still a lot of people up in those areas that still fish for carp. Just don't read about it as much as we used to. Maybe because they don't frequent my board like they used to. I don't know.
What were those Columbia River carp eating? Were they eating whistlers?
I might have caught a carp on a whistler.
No, he was catching them on those dragon boogers.
Yeah.
You know what I catch them in the Meadowlands? I catch them on shad darts, green ones.
Really?
Yeah. They'll eat shad darts. And last year I caught one on, believe it or not, a green gold-ribbed hare's ear. So, but anyway, gentlemen, and Lou and Dan and Henry, this has been such an incredible evening. Listening to you, Dan, tell these stories. I mean, it's historical. And Henry, you're like an encyclopedia. I like bow to your greatness. So, and I can't thank you enough for guest hosting Dan. I can't thank you enough. Our first phone call a couple of months ago, introducing myself to you through Henry kindly, was just a wonderful talk. And I'm so glad you were able to come here tonight. And I know Lou feels very similarly to how I feel tonight, Lou.
Absolutely. It's just been a huge pleasure and an honor to have you here and sharing just so much of your wisdom, a lifetime of experience with everyone here. And I hope I know we were busy talking, so you probably didn't have a chance to see the chat, but folks have been typing up a storm since we started, and just so much love from everyone in the audience for you and for you, Henry, and for all of the innovation and all of the history that you guys represent. So thanks for being here. It's really a pleasure, and we will hope to have you back on an episode in the not too distant future.
Yeah. Now let me before we get off the air, I just want to remind everybody who attended tonight of all this fun stuff that's going to be available to you.
And so maybe, David, we should just tell everyone. So if you are in attendance, we have your name in the Zoom logs. So everyone who attends, each show you attend is like getting a lottery ticket. So the more shows you attend, the more chances you have to win. And then we'll do the drawing at the last show with Nick Curcione on April 8th. And we should probably also announce that the next show is March 18th with Brad Buzzy. I know another buddy of Henry's and many other people here. Yeah. So we look forward to having you all there for that too. But Dan and Henry, thank you so much for an incredible evening. Appreciate your being here.
Thank you, gentlemen. It was an incredible pleasure.
Dan, I love you, buddy. And I love Cindy. And I'm just so happy you agreed to do this.
Yeah, I love you too, buddy. I just seen a couple names pop up from somebody who was watching it. Some old friends of mine that hadn't talked to in years. They just pop up on a little screen down here, that little message that they've been watching.
Yeah, so Dave Studeman came on tonight to make sure he'd hear you.
Yeah, and Nick Curcione, I don't know, but he was one of my oldest best friends that I met on a fish shop down to Southern California, Redondo Beach, where he, like I said, I mentioned before.
Great guy.
Yeah, he met me in the parking lot. He met my bus when I was unloading the Greyhound bus. He came up, wanted to know if Dan Blanton was there. And I said, we've been friends ever since. Nick.
Well, maybe when Nick is on in April, Henry, we can get both of you guys back to say hello.
You'll have to get Nick to agree to that. Maybe if he watches the rerun of this on YouTube next week, he'll agree to it, because I know Dan was nervous that I wouldn't behave myself, but I thought I did.
Oh, you were great.
You did a great job.
I wouldn't expect.
Don't worry, I'll be emailing the edited version of this to Nick as soon as we get it. So yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
One thing for sure. Nick and I both could handle anything Henry can dish out.
Famous last words. We're gonna take you up on that.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
For joining us.